What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all doing well. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to click here on another video. And today we're going to be talking about a new film hitting theaters this weekend that I was pretty interested in checking out, and that film is called The Life of Chuck. Written and directed by Mike Flanagan, this is based on a story by Stephen King and stars people like Tom Hiddleston, Chiwetel Ejiofor, Karen Gillan, Jacob Tremblay, Mark Hamill, and more. And before we get too far into this video, if you guys are a fan of up-to-date reviews like this, as well as early reviews, live streams, retrospective reviews, and the occasional vlog, you're in the right place. Consider subscribing and helping this small channel grow. But if you're a returning viewer, I really appreciate you. As always, thanks so much for coming back. And as I already mentioned, we're talking about The Life of Chuck. Now, this is coming from writer-director Mike Flanagan, and immediately that's what pulled me into this movie. I've really loved his work in the world of horror, and in recent years, everything he's done on Netflix, starting with The Haunting of Hill House up to his more recent The Fall of the House of Usher. I've just been a real big fan of the various projects that this man has been a part of and all of the various cast members he's worked with over the course of his career. So when I saw he was going to be doing a brand new film that was going to be based on a Stephen King story, I was pretty excited. Then I see Tom Hiddleston's in the lead role. I was just like, okay, cool, this is definitely something that piques my interest. But going into it, despite the fact that as a cinephile and as somebody who's plugged into the conversation around upcoming films, I had seen so much about this film. I had seen the poster a million times. I'd seen a lot of my personal peers being able to actually see this at film festivals on social media. I'd seen so much coverage of this film, but never watched a trailer, and nor did I ever seek out the synopsis. So I went into this completely blind, which is not really the very common thing that happens for somebody who covers a lot of movies like I do online. I just feel like whether you're going to the theater and you see a trailer there or you just see it online at some point, it's kind of hard to skip over marketing. And this was just one that I kind of just skated by. So with all that said, let's get into what this film is all about, and then we'll get into my thoughts on this one. The Life of Chuck tells the story of Charles Krantz in reverse, beginning with his death and ending in his childhood. As the world mysteriously falls apart, Chuck's life is revealed piece by piece, showing how one man's existence can shape the world in unexpected ways. Going into this film, as I already mentioned, I didn't know what it was about, but immediately I was pulled in by the Mike Flanagan element, the fact that you have Tom Hiddleston as this Chuck individual, and the rest of the really strong cast here. I already mentioned that you have people like Karen Gillan in there, you have Mark Hamill in here, you also have people like Nick Offerman who narrates the various acts of this film, the various chapters over certain sequences throughout the course of the film. And one thing that's been great over the course of Mike Flanagan's career is seeing all of the very talented people he's had the opportunity to work with. And in recent years, with his Netflix series that I've already mentioned, he's had the same cast return for the most part in each of those series, just playing different characters in a new story. A lot of times mixing and matching different actors, having new actors kind of come into the mix, but a lot of times retaining majority of the cast that he had in the last one, or getting some new ones that would come on board and then they would show up in the next thing. So similarly, if you have been watching Mike Flanagan's work over the course of the last decade or so, you are going to be recognizing a lot of the various actors that he works with in his projects in this film, which was immediately such a cool part of this film. This film has so many big names in it, even if it's in just small little roles, these little cameo-esque roles, and it was great. Mike Flanagan himself makes a cameo in here, and of course, like always, he cast his wife Kate Siegel in a small role in the film as well. So, you know, you have the big names in here like Tom Hiddleston, you have Mark Hamill who worked with him before, you also have Karen Gillan who worked with him before, and you have other names like Chiwetel Ejiofor in here and so many others, and I was just immediately blown away by all the big faces that you see in this film, that many of which are not on the posters and many of which are not even in the trailer or anything that I've seen now that I've seen the film. Like, it just doesn't seem like they're fully marketing the full cast, which made for a surprise, definitely made for an exciting time to watch, because it's always great to watch a film that's well made by a very strong filmmaker that also has a bunch of big familiar faces that you know and love from various projects. With all that said, going into this film, the last thing I thought this film was going to be was what it is, because I really didn't know what this film was going to be about, but I didn't expect it to be structured the way it is. As I already said when I was reading the plot synopsis, this is a film that is told in reverse. It's told in a 3-act structure like most films, but it starts specifically saying Act 3. So you already know you're starting at the end of the film, which is a bold choice because it's one thing to start the film with a sequence that's near the end of the film or with the last scene, and then you go back and then the story builds up to that final sequence. But in the case of this film, we are watching the entire story in reverse, and so you're not really connected to the character of Chuck at a time in his life that you're probably meant to the most. And it isn't really until later on in the film, specifically for me in the 3rd act, where you find yourself more connected to this Chuck individual and have a greater understanding of what that first 3rd act was actually doing. And so I thought that was an interesting thing because the 3rd act starts off like a post-apocalyptic kind of thing. Maybe not post-apocalyptic, but an apocalyptic kind of situation. The world is going to crap. Cell signals are down, internet is down, humans are wondering what life is going to be. Parts of the continent of the US and other countries and continents are completely being flooded and falling apart. The stars are starting to vanish. And so you're like, what is going on in this film? And then that first act ends and you start to get a bit of a better picture, but there's still some confusion. And it's really not until the 3rd act, the very end of the film, where you start to get a grand understanding of what we're seeing and what the symbolism is behind the things you saw earlier in the film. And so I think this is one of those films that immediately is asking the audience member to go along for a journey. This isn't a film that's going to be cookie cutter. This isn't a film that's going to hand you answers on a plate. It eventually does give you those answers. So I wouldn't say this is a film that leaves you, kind of lost and wondering what to make of the film, but there is some ambiguity around certain things. There is an element of kind of piece it together yourself. Here are the ingredients, but I'm not going to completely spell it out for you. But it was an interesting approach to telling a story nonetheless, and I think that had this film been put in the hands of a less competent director than Mike Flanagan, it possibly could have been incredibly messy and maybe not had the same impact that it did. Now, one thing that's important to say here, though, is that while Tom Hiddleston is on all of the marketing, all of the posters, he is the big face because he is Chuck, I would honestly say that his iteration of Chuck in the film isn't even the version of Chuck that you find yourself connected to. The middle section of the film is really where we start to get to know Chuck as the version that you see on all the marketing, and it's pretty brief in the grand scheme of things. It's pretty surface level in terms of who he is. And really what you see in that 2nd act of Tom Hiddleston as this character is only further expanded upon when you get to see the 3rd act, which is technically the 1st act, which is when he's substantially younger, and it really informs who he is in that 2nd act and truly informs what you were seeing at the very beginning of the film. So this is one of those movies that I can see myself revisiting in the future and having a completely different outlook on. With that said, though, I would be lying if I said this film had the same rewatchability as other films that Mike Flanagan has done. Despite the fact that I found this film to be really interestingly well put together and very well acted and just a very clever idea, I found it to be a film that at times did meander and at times I think is trying to get across something that I think took a little bit too much time to get to. With that said, though, I do want to praise the fact that this is a film that takes you on a journey. I think in a world where we have a lot of films that feel very commercial, in a world where we have a lot of films that feel very much like they were made for a TikTok generation or just for people with a shorter attention span, I like that Mike Flanagan made a film here that is a slower film, a film that requires you to sit with it, understand what's going on while sitting through these sequences, and not really being spoon-fed the dialogue, not really being spoon-fed the overall story and all the things that are going to answer all the questions. I was actually seated next to a young woman who seemed to really enjoy the film, so this is not a knock towards her. But throughout the entirety of the film, she felt the need to audibly, very loudly whisper, "What? Oh, huh?" All these different kind of moments. And she was by herself, by the way. She wasn't with anybody else. It was just her. And so she was kept making these audible noises. And so while I do think that she started to understand the film as we got to the last 10 or 15 minutes of the movie, I do think there was a lot of the film where she was struggling to try to piece things together. Because again, while I personally found this film to be something that was giving me the answers in a very interesting way in the latter part of the film, it is a film that does kind of have you scratching your brain for portions of time. It is not a film that just flat out gives you the answer in the first half of the film. It's really a movie that says, hey, sit here with us. We're going to take you on a ride. It's going to be a very personal, drama-heavy, slower ride. And by the time you get to the end, maybe it's not going to be for everybody, but it's going to be a film that ultimately has some things to say about life, has some things to say about ourselves, has some things to say about what our own personal worlds are like in our mind, and what we can, carry with us, what we can create within ourselves based on our personal experiences and those around us, and what we can be to ourselves in a lot of ways. And I thought that was a really interesting thing with this film. It felt very different. It did not feel like a run-of-the-mill popcorn film or something that you see come out in theaters often. This is the kind of film that, while I know it's getting a lot of buzz within the cinephile world, it is the kind of film that I see could definitely kind of go underground in terms of the world of film. It's not the kind of film that I see most mainstream people probably flocking to see, but I do think for the most part, Mike Flanagan has made a good name for himself in the world of even casual moviegoers and, TV watchers. That even though this isn't necessarily in his traditional wheelhouse of horror, I think he creates a really interesting film here that ultimately, on a filmmaking level, is incredibly well acted. It's very emotional in its own way. It definitely kind of resonates with you on a very personal level. And by the time the movie comes to an end, well, I kind of left the theater thinking that wasn't everything I was hoping it would be. I didn't love it, but I still can genuinely say I really enjoyed it and experience something different. I think in a year where maybe we've had a lot of remakes this year, or we've had a lot of, sequels, or we've had, just some maybe underwhelming films this year, even though I do think there's been some great films this year as well, including some, things that are tied to franchises and stuff. It's nice to see a film like this that, again, despite the fact that I can't say I loved everything about it, I do think that it's a film that has something to say. I do think it's a film that is unique in the modern day, and I do think it's a film that ultimately is something that a lot of people will be able to relate to, especially if you're, like me, somebody who oftentimes creates worlds in their own head. Maybe sometimes you feel alone, sometimes you feel scared of the world or the future, your own future of mortality, and this film kind of really is about living in the moment, but also allowing yourself to be creative and allowing yourself to, explore who you are and explore your own mind, and the notion that, you can be more than what you just seem on the outside. And I'm kind of giving surface level because I do think that this is a film that you kind of have to experience a little bit more to fully take something away from it. Now, with all that said, because of the way that the film is structured, because of the way that the story is told, I can see people walking away from this film thinking, I don't get it. I can see people walking away from this film thinking, that wasn't really for me. It was a little bit slow. I was a little bored at times. Tom Hiddleston wasn't really in it much. He wasn't even like the Chuck I cared for. I liked Chuck more when he was a kid. I think that's something that the film isn't really selling either. There's a big chunk near the end of the film, in the third act, where we get to meet the character of Chuck as a young boy and get to kind of see his admiration for dance. And it was that section of the film where I found myself really in love with Chuck, but you don't get there until the end of the film. And so it's this film that really does work in reverse in a really interesting way, because like a lot of other films where you'll find yourself falling in love with the character more as the film goes on, this film still maintains that structure, but it's being told in the opposite way of that person's life. So the saddest moment of that character's life, you're not nearly as sad for them as you are when they're substantially younger and you can see where their life is going because you've already seen it happen. It's an interesting approach. It's different. It's unique. It's not going to be for everybody. I won't even say that everything about it was for me. I do think there were elements about the pacing. I do think there was elements about the way that the story was structured. I do think that there were elements about some of it meandering at times that I do think kind of held it back at times. But ultimately, this is a creative choice and a creative approach that I do think ultimately I find to be really admirable in the modern day. And so sitting on it on my drive back home and sitting down and writing my notes for the film, I ultimately just found myself more in a place of admiration for what Mike Flanagan did here, more so than looking at this film as something that I'm clamoring to rewatch and show others, but I'm glad I saw it. So that's going to be my thoughts on The Life of Chuck, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say. Have you seen this film? Have you not seen this film? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.